Okay, and then I'm going to share my screen, folks. Let me adjust this a bit. Does it look good? Yeah, great. Okay, so welcome everyone. This lecture is going to be the first of a series that is going to extend beyond the core that we started with. So we're going to talk today about convolutional neural networks and how this extends upon what we've discussed so far, which has been largely grounded on these fully connected dense layers in terms of architectures. Then after the next lecture, we're going to then sequence through other types of ideas that are similar extensions from this course. So we're going to be talking about recurrent networks. Then we're going to move into other topics like transformers and sequence to sequence. We're going to cherry pick some of the sort of highlights of what's happened recently, as well as some of the main workhorses of the deep learning sort of era here. But let's begin with convolutions. And this is a subject that is really told all over the internet. There's so many different lectures that talk about CNNs. And so I was thinking about and talking to the others about how we could sort of enter into this material in a slightly different fashion. And then what we thought would be interesting is to frame the discussion today to not only tell you about convolutional neural networks, how they function, what they're good at doing, telling you about the core of them and then extending it out, but also framing this discussion from the perspective of inductive bias. And so inductive bias is one way to think about this. It's a way to embed external knowledge in the design of any type of machine learning model. And so it's very useful for trying to deal with cases perhaps when you don't have enough data, or having a situation where you have a very strong reason to shape the model, the form of the model. Perhaps you have a certain application in mind. And so in many ways, the convolutional neural networks we're talking today have this property, and they are moving from fully connected dense layers to the convolutional operator as a demonstration of particular types of inductive bias. But before I move forward, what I want to do is just give you a very sort of couple of examples of inductive bias and how it can help. So I actually lifted this example from Wolfram Gessner at EPFL. Here's this wonderful example in a generic sort of situation of inductive bias, where he's saying, imagine I have a model that's being written here up at the top. I'm trying to predict an outcome, Y. And as I move around the x-axis, what I can do is I can introduce into this model an inductive bias about how the parameters of the model relate to each other. So, for example, if we make an assumption about W3 equaling W4. Then this can radically shape the way that we can fit data to the model, because we have the strong assumptions about these three terms all are going to sum to zero. And so when you fit data, it might look something more like this. Versus if you had other types of data with no assumptions, it could have a different sort of fit, and you need more data to actually eventually fit your model. And as you change these strong assumptions, they would play out in different ways. So for example, if we change from these to something else, such as we might have, say, W1 and W2, and fix all of these terms to be the same, then the data would actually allow for models that are more like a parabola. And so the point here is that you have your design of your model, you have external information that you want to be able to sort of lock in, and that's going to affect what type of models are possible from this design. And so if I turn off the drawing and go forward, if we think about the fully connected neural networks that we've discussed up to this point, we can think of them in terms of being having far fewer sort of baked-in assumptions to the types of networks we're going to be talking about today. And in fact, today we're going to be considering what are the types of changes you'd want to make? What are the types of assumptions you'd want to build into this network, starting from this point, to enable it to do excellent jobs and tasks such as vision? What are the types of properties you'd want to see in there, and so forth? And then more broadly speaking, in terms of inductive bias and neural networks, you could see many different types of neural networks that we've seen so far all have some different types of assumptions baked in. So for example, if we go back to the lecture by Freck last week, we were talking about prioritizing models that are going to be trainable by gradient descent. As we look forward, today with CNNs, and then in future weeks, such as RNNs and other types of networks we're going to present, there are going to be other types of inductive bias represented. So the ones we're talking about today are going to promote looking for spatial connections or having certain invariants as you move in the visual domain objects around the visual field. All the different models we'll be talking about have elements of this in there. But just to sort of exit out this, to summarize this sort of introduction, what I would say is that when you start to choose specific forms of neural network architectures, this is a way that you're able to embed in explicit forms of inductive bias. So let's talk a little bit about what are we embedding inside convolutional neural networks. And so that's part two of this, the next part of this lecture. We're going to start to look at what are the types of properties we want them to have. And to illustrate this, I'm going to show their main property, which is translational invariance. And so what you're seeing here is an animation where we're presenting a model with an image. And then as you see the animation change, we're going from the image to a digital representation. So that's what the computer obviously sees. And then on the right-hand side of the animation, we are illustrating this notion of translational invariance that we want our CNNs to have. And so what you're seeing here is you're imagining a situation where you have, in this case, it's a digit. You want to be able to recognize this digit. And we want to have our model react similarly, identically to the same input, regardless of where it happens to be inside the input. Below, we have an example of a model that does not have this property. And so you can see that as the 3, in this case, moves around the input, you can see the output of the model is actually changing, even though the input of interest here doesn't change at all. And so this is an example that you might have if you're trying to, in this case, read checks, was one of the original types of applications of CNNs that were very successful. Now the question is, if you want to have this property built into your model, or how are you going to achieve it? And so the primitive that we're going to build into our neural network to enable this type of invariance that's going to be so useful for applications such as the vision domain is going to be built on what we're going to call a kernel, and that's being shown in the middle here. We're going to have a set of parameters that are going to be logically grouped. In this case, we've got a 3x3 matrix. And then our inputs, we're going to imagine our inputs here are going to be a two-dimensional input, such as an image. We've simplified the input to be a set of zeros and ones. And then we're going to move the kernel. We're going to introduce logic into the network such that we're going to move the kernel over the image or the input, striding it. Every time we place the kernel over the image, we're going to do an element-wise multiplication. Then we're going to sum them up. And each time we do that, we're going to fill in the output. And this is going to be the feature that each of these is going to be elements of the feature that each kernel generates. And so we're going to build is a neural network that is going to contain many kernels, that each of which are going to produce features that allow us to do different types of tasks based on the input. You can do things such as recognize different objects. Later on in this lecture, we're going to show how you can even use these types of models to generate different types of output as you try to do things such as image restoration. Most of the examples I'm going to talk about are image-based because that is sort of the main sort of target and use case for these applications or for these models. There's a diverse set of tasks that they're able to do. And so at the end, I'm going to give you a few other examples of applications that are there. But if we just move through this example, you can see what I was just mentioning. So we're defining this primitive called a kernel, and it's applied to the input by striding across. If you see this animation, each time it strides across, there's the element-wise multiplication that is then summed to generate a new element of the convolved feature that you can see on the right here happening. And then this is formalized up here with this equation. Yeah, just in terms of the context of this this visualization. So to start to expand out the concepts that are in convolutional neural networks, I want to introduce 3 new concepts. We've talked about this raw primitive, this idea of using a kernel and striding across the input. It's paired with, there's 3 other concepts here I want to introduce. This is notion of kernel size. And so this is an animation, this is a very commonly seen animation where you have your input, you have the darkened the darkened striding shadow over the input is the kernel as it's striding across the input, and then what's being seen in this green thing at the top is the actual output projection. And so you can have kernels of different sizes. So we've talked about 3 by 3. Early CNNs, early convolutional neural networks used 11 by 11. Had these big receptive fields. So there's this notion of being able to parameterize the size of the kernel. You'll then also have this sort of concept of striding. So as it moves across the input, you can define how is it going to move in terms of the number of spaces that it's striding. You notice here that it's striding by 2. You could stride by 1, so you would only move over 1 element in the matrix. And then this notion of padding. Padding is needed that if you want to have the kernel move over parts of the input for which it would require it to sort of bleed over the edge, then you're going to have this notion of padding that allows you to have this ability. What's being shown here at the top is the equation. This is for each dimension of this green output. You can have that. Using this equation, you can calculate what the dimension is, and essentially, it's summarizing how large this output need to be, given the size of the kernel. So, given the size of the input, given the size of the kernel, and given the size of the padding P, all of those values are mixed in to say, well, how much. How large does this projection outwards need to be given the size of the kernel, how it's moving, and what's the size of the input that moves across? Now, what's interesting? Yes,
Nick, sorry to interrupt. I'm not a co-host. There are some people in the waiting room. Can you?
Oh, sorry.
Either make me a co-host or let them in. Thanks.
Sure. One second. Let me just let them all in. I'm sorry. I got into what I was doing.
I also forget about this. Sorry about that.
It says Sam. Let me just to see if I can just make you co-host. I just want to make sure right, that'd be really logical to do that. So then, yeah, okay. So you can.
Thanks.
Okay, and so slowly what we're trying to do is building up just an understanding of how these networks work, and then we're going to explain like why they're designed this way and so forth. But the next point I want to make is that you might be thinking to yourself, well, these seem like a brand new primitive to me. I've heard about, you know, from Neil or Fred, the stacking of these functions and so on, and I kind of see some loose correspondence. But what I want to make crystal clear is that there's actually a very clear correspondence from the primitive that we just described that has these nice properties of being able to, for example, learn features that are going to be able to detect the presence of local local features regardless of where they happen to appear in the input, for example, and so forth. There's a direct correspondence between that design where we're baking in some assumptions about how we want the model to operate and the more relaxed looser form of the fully connected dense layers that we've seen so far. And so I wanted to describe this correspondence to you because it's not always completely obvious. That's what this diagram is showing you here. On the left-hand side, we have this familiar animation that we were just looking at. So if I just move through it, you can see this, and that kind of essentially just describes the behavior we just saw. On the far right, we have an illustration of a fully connected network. And I've carefully drawn this so that the colors are actually meaningful. So we want to, I'm going to describe for you how this operation is going to be equivalent to doing this operation here, where we have a fully connected network. What we want to do is we have our input here. This is so in our in the way that we've looked at this so far, we have this fully connected input here, and which is going to correspond to this here. The output, we're going to imagine have 4 nodes, so that's the same as what we have here. And then this nice visual color-coded representation is going to be very useful for us to understanding, for example, how the weights correspond, the input corresponds, and so forth. So the first thing to think of is that this is our input. We've talked about them being a two-dimensional input so far, although and then the other types of architectures we've talked about thus far have been always with this just a linear set of inputs. Or to do this, you just need to linearize out the input. So we have a series of elements that we're simply just going to have an agreement about how we're going to linearize them out. And that's how we set them. That's the correspondence here. On the other side, we have another similar thing. So you can have a zigzag linearization of that shape, right? So this element to that element to that element being encoded here. So that's how they correspond. Then the next thing to think about is, well, how do the connections correspond? So you'll note that there is, right, so if you look at the receptor field here of this kernel is going to map to this here, which maps to these connections here. So this red, orange, I guess, so I should say the first, the second, I guess the fourth and the sixth weights in the fully connected network. And then so you might say to yourself, well, what happens to the other connections here? And so then what we're going to do to have the fully connected network produce the same type of behavior as we have in the convolutional layer here, this primitive, is zero out all the other weights. They all these dotted lines indicate a zeroing out of the weights. And then interestingly, to have the behavior consistent across, remember this linearized out input to here, as you know, as I play the animation, if I undo the drawing and then I play it through, you'll see that the kernel is striding across the input, right? And so then if you think about it, the weight that is used here in this cell is the same one that's going to be used here, is the same one that is going to be used here. And then is this going to be the same one used here? And then, so if we look over to the other side, the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that these coloring of the weights is also consistent for this reason. So I made these all red to indicate they are going to be, for these two transformations to be equivalent, these weights here need to be always forced to be the same. So all these red are the same, all the orange are the same, and so forth. And so essentially, once you have all those in place, these two views of a neural network that may at first glance look very different are in fact actually equivalent, and the CNN is a special case of the fully connected network with some additional constraints added. And those constraints are the particular type of bias that we're talking about. You're going to instill that bias so that then the network learns certain model behavior much more quickly with less data, because we've inserted this external pieces of information so it behaves in a certain way. And then what you'll see is that this type of behavior that we're instilling allows a CNN to learn more quickly and stronger models that react better to vision data. Now, if I move forward, I wanted to add sort of a last piece to this puzzle, and that is this issue of channels. If you think of, there's a lot of types of data that's going to have more than one dimension to it. And then if we just think about it in the vision case, and the natural example of it is going to be RGB. So we have red, blue, green. And so the way we'll treat those is that we can have, so you can, this is meant to be, this is the input that we've seen so far. We're just now going to extend the notions that we've had so far to allow the inputs to have additional dimensions. So this could be thought of as RGB, red, blue, green. You combine them together to form a tensor that describes all the colors of the input that we see when images. And then what we're seeing here is that before we've talked about having one kernel, we're now going to have, we've talked about this sort of notion. Now we're going to have additional matrices that describe the type of behavior. They are going to learn parameters that will define how the transformations happen from layer to layer, with this, with each of these corresponding to different channels. You'll notice here that we're basically adding in more complexity to give you a fuller point of view of the description of the picture. We have also bias terms here. And then as I sort of advance through this animation, you'll see again element-wise multiplications occurring. When we want to fill in each of these, the output of these kernels, we'll see that there's a correspondence between a kernel that's defined for a kernel that's defined across the set of channels that we have as the input, and there's a one-to-one correspondence between these kernels and the output channels. So we have this output 1, and we have this second output 2. And there's always going to be a one-to-one correspondence. Then if I advance it forward, you'll see the full description of how this how each of these layers will process the data step by step. Right, so I think that's pretty clear. Okay. Waiting for time, good. Sorry, I didn't turn up the drawing. So one thing I haven't mentioned so far is this this set of slides I designed it similarly to how I designed the last ones, although I had some problem with being able to easily share those slides with you because of the issue of GPU, CPU that I haven't quite overcome yet. But these are much easier to share because they only target the CPU. And so what I've done is I've made a Docker image where you can explore these primitives I'm talking about, how they function and so on. And so what I'm going to go through now is just show you some of the code that will hopefully allow you to kind of make this connection about how do these primitives I've described behave on real data and have some of the properties I'm talking about. And so this first example is just showing you, if I just run it, you're able to get an input. And then, for example, this slide here, if you run it yourself or you want to modify it, will generate a random kernel and then apply it. If you look at the code behind the slide, apply it to generate the output or this feature map. So let me just run this for you. So, but it'll populate it element by element, much in the way they've talked about so far, but on their random kernel. Okay. So this brings me to this next example that what I wanted to do was experiment with different types of parameters manually set inside these kernels and showed you the type of behavior that can happen. So for this, we're going to have an example of a Fox input. So it'll first, I need to run this for it to work. We have a Fox. And then in the code, you see this these parameters here. These are manually set. And so what I've done is I've cherry-picked parameters that are actually aligned to a hand-designed, handcrafted edge detectors. And what you can see is that when you put in these specific types of parameters of various types of hand-defined edge detectors, and then you run these convolutions across the input, you'll see that they're able to produce transformations that can start to have discriminative power, where you might have, for example, here, this would be edge detector. So if we run it across that input of a Fox, we're going to see, oh, sorry, this is a visualization of the kernel. So you can see that so the last one was random. This is defined based on what we populated here. So just to kind of explain, so the high values like 1 are obviously white, darker value, lower values like -1 are darker, and it's sort of scaled based on the values that are seen in the matrix. If I move forward, and I've used this already, but let me just run it for you. Kind of spoiled the outcome there. And so you can see that by having even just that single kernel that is run across the input, and then we sum the channel-wise. We do this element-wise multiplication to get the spatial information. Then we do the sum to sum across the channels. We can see edges being able to be detected from the image. And so once you can start to, essentially in aggregate, these different kernels that comprise layers within a CNN will be able to build up the ability to discriminate from different types of inputs, such as a fox and an elephant, or a variety of different types of tasks, depending on what they're trying to do. So what would be interesting is that for this type of example I just gave you, I used hand specified parameters. So let's look at some of the parameters that might be learned from an actual model where we're doing an optimization process along the lines of what Ferenc was showing us in earlier slides or earlier lectures. So for that, I'm going to first load this image. And what might surprise you is, well, why does the input is still the same fox, But the reason why that I've allowed you to see what the actual true input to the network is, that I want you to see what is it. I want to point out the fact that for these things to work, you often do some pre-processing. So in this case, there's some normalization and whitening done across the input. And then this is going to be a series of kernels that are contained with an actual trained neural network. It's actually mobile net that we'll be discussing a little bit later in these slides. And what I want you to see is that some of them might look something along the lines of the examples I gave of these sort of hand-tuned kernels, and others are going to look completely different from them. So if I just run this, it's going to cycle through various kernels that have been learnt from the data, where the loss is trying to create a classifier that's able to discriminate between different types of classes of object. And then if I want to stop, I want to particularly stop it here. What's interesting is that you can see examples like this one, where the system has learnt a filter, a kernel, that is parameterized quite similar to the hand parameterized edge detectors I used earlier, with strong values in the middle, weak on the side. And then you'll note, though, that if you look at the other kernels, things are completely different. And the point here is that the learning algorithm is not trying to learn particular kernels that align to certain types of semantics. It's not trying to say, I want to recognize this type of edge or this type of sort of aggregate shape. What it's trying to do is just learn kernels that in combination with each other are going to have transformations across the different layers that eventually allow it to discriminate between different classes. So it's not any explicit learning of particular type of semantics here. And let's look at what happens when we apply them. Cool. So again, this is just the application of those kernels that we're loading in through it from an actual model, and then applying them. This is the output channel. So this is the these are the when you have your input and you're applying each of those kernels I just saw, you'll see them producing output of various kinds. And so the idea here is that when activations are applied, they're going to have high values in aspects that they're very interested in. So one point here is that different kernels are keying in on different types of information. You'll see this first one has low values, or has low values here to do with the background, high values to do with just generally different parts of the shape of the object. Other kernels here seem to be doing different types of edge detectors. So you can see them being excited, having high values corresponding to different shapes within the object that are going to then be able to be combined together to recognize patterns that are associated with certain classes of this type. And then I've just split apart between the transformation solely related to the weights, and then there's transformation that is that occurs when we apply the activation function. In this case, ReLU over the top, but that's not so salient. But just to summarize where we are now, so far we've talked about this primitive use of kernels that allow us to learn features that are localized. They look for localized pieces of information that can occur anywhere across the input, because those are sort of the biases that we want to encode in the model that align, in this case, very well to the recognition of images. If you want to, for example, recognize a glass, that a glass might be placed anywhere inside an image. It'll have a local structure that's fairly consistent with the object class of a glass. And so you want to have a model that's going to learn features that react to local pieces of information with the entire input, and that react consistently no matter where that pattern happens to occur inside the image. And that is some of the types of properties that we get from being able to have this kernel approach to processing the information layer by layer. And then I've talked about how there's this correspondence between fully connected and this particular design where our biases allowed us to make simplifying assumptions about how it should function, operate, to allow it to work well in this case. And so what I want to do in the remainder of this lecture is just talk about a number of different extensions that are quite relevant to how these things function. I'm going to talk about pooling. I'm going to talk about this interesting notion of depthwise separable convolutions. We're going to briefly touch on superresolution as an alternative application at the end. I just want to show you a completely different application other than image to give you a sense of its flexibility. It's not only about images, it's about being able to recognize localized piece of information that exists within a larger input that also has this sort of invariance to different types of translation. So let's move through these fairly quickly. So this first, I just wanted to introduce another form. You could think of this as a special form of convolution that is going to be added to the set of tools we have to be able to build architectures from. And you could think of this as a kernel that doesn't have any parameters to learn, where instead of having parameters, you're going to have a function attached to it. So you could, these are used to do, say, a transformation that might downsample input, or make a summarization from a set of kernels to summarize information that's being seen. And then on the right-hand side, you could see it in practice. So there's no parameters of the kernel to be learned, but what you're seeing here is the input. This is the output. It's color-coded in this toy example so you can see what's going on. It behaves exactly the same as the kernels that we've talked about so far. So that it has the same notion of striding across the input. So it needs to be parameterized in terms of its size. So it's a receptive field. So here we have 2 by 2. It need to parameterize it in terms of its stride. Is it going to move across 1 or 2? Padding and so forth. Those need to be specified. And in this case, for example, we have a 2 by 2. We're going to stride across 2, and we're going to use a max operation. This is called max pooling. So when the max pooling kernel is applied here, it's going to pick the largest value, and that is the one that's propagated here to the output. So this operation can be used in combination with the conventional kernels we've discussed so far. And you'll use it in cases where perhaps you need to do some type of downsampling or summarization within the series of transformations that you're doing. It's also important because you can instantiate these with very few parameters, of course, because there's no kernel parameters to learn, so the size of your model doesn't increase, although the amount of computation still is present, because the computation to update from layer to layer still exists. And then here is just some code that allows you to play around with this operation as well. And I also then want to highlight this notion of architectures. I've realized up into this sequence of lectures, we haven't really talked a lot about architectures that combine many of the different components we've discussed so far. And so I thought it would be interesting to just consider quite an old architecture, that of AlexNet, and let's look at it. This was actual diagram taken straight from the paper, and you can see how it combines and basically many of the components we've discussed so far in lectures. So you'll see here, this is straight from the original paper in 2012, and you'll see that it's defining, this is the input. They're using 11 by 11 in this case, convolutions. Then we have a series of these kernels being applied to the input, and then the output of this process is used to build this output matrix here that we've talked about before, and the output of this layer is the input to the corresponding one. What you also see here is at the end of this network is a series of fully connected layers, such as the ones we've talked about prior to this lecture. The other point I'd like to make out is that just tying into what I talked about last week on Thursday, interestingly, they've had to divide the design of their network in two simply to fit within the memory constraints of the GPU. So the GPU at times is around 2012 only had 3 gigabytes of GPU memory, and as a consequence, purely to fit within the constraints of the hardware they have available, so excuse me, they divided their convolutional layers in two. So you'll note that these essentially form two separate tracks. There's a split line here where they literally can have one part of the model running on one GPU, and because there's excuse me, because there's very little communication occurring between them, they're able to maintain a good throughput. And this is just a quick summary. I want to be able to get towards the make basically 2 more points. But essentially, this is just showing you, given that design, you can see how, in comparison to the fully connected layers, they use it. Fully connected layers require a huge increase in the number of parameters for them to be described, in comparison to the convolutional layers. And then the reason for that is that if you think back to that illustration I showed you that showed the correspondence between the two, you saw that so many of the free parameters of the feed-forward layer, and when described as a convolution, are set to 0, and a number of them have a weight sharing occurring, so that the number of parameters that need to be learned are just far fewer. And so you can have very powerful convolutional layers that use this bias, where we include the assumptions on how they should behave that are not just learned from the data alone, to have powerful transformation abilities, but with far fewer parameters than is necessary in the fully connected layers. Now, extending from this, people have thought about other ways of designing convolutional layers. And so I wanted just to illustrate what has turned out to be a very popular second type of convolutional layers, that are called Depthwise Separable convolutions. Before I get to describe the benefits of them, I just wanted to describe very briefly how they function. The ones I've talked about thus far can be considered on the left-hand side. Let's call them vanilla convolutions. And the way to think about this is that these vanilla convolutions, they do actually 2 roles. They are first performing sort of a summary of spatial information. That's what happens with this element-wise matrix multiplication. So if you take in the case that we have the kernel, because the input is in 3 dimensions, there's going to be a kernel with 3 dimensions here, each dimension dealing with a different type of, in this case, channel. And then job 1 is that they perform this element-wise matrix multiplication on the input. You can think of that as them digesting the spatial information that exists within the input. Stage 2 is when they digest the channel-wise information. And so what they do is they do this sum. So they're summing across what they've learnt and then populating each element of the output, right? So if you think about vanilla convolutions in this form, then when you then what depthwise separable convolutions do becomes a bit easier to understand. what they do is that they try to separate these two distinct jobs as two separate layers. And they have, and they make an inductive bias, an additional inductive bias on the design of the convolution to say that all convolutional kernels that they're going to have inside their network are actually going to be a linear sum of shared spatial pieces of information. So they have, so for each channel they have 3 channels, and no matter how many kernels, no matter how many logical kernels they wanted to build up, they're going to have only they're going to have one layer whose sole role is to aggregate the spatial information, and that's what happens here. And then they have a second layer that is going to complete and form the different logical kernels they want to have, where they're going to have just the channel-wise information aggregated. And so each convolutional each convolutional kernel that they design is going to share the spatial information, but have different combinations of the channel-wise information. So they can have, for example, here they have 2 logical kernels being built to correspond to the 2 vanilla convolutions we see here. But in fact, I could have an architecture that has, as many of these, as many additional kernels as I would desire, and I would just have different combinations of these spatial extractors. And so for that reason, I can have many convolutional kernels that do nearly the same type of expressive capability to extract information from the input, but using far fewer parameters. Because if you think of these kernels here, they're going to have 3 by 3 by 3 parameters each kernel. Whereas this one, because they're sharing information, they only have to pay for the parameters in these 3 here, and then each new kernel they introduce is only going to have enough parameters to describe how this channel information needs to be assembled. So it's a really important and powerful primitive that extends from observations such as AlexNet, that the number of parameters starts to really get out of hand. Oops, I shouldn't have pressed that button. This is the button I want to press. Oops. And there's code there that you can explore that does this. And what I want to do is just show that this happens to be MobileNet version 1 here. And you can actually see this construction of these pairs of layers that perform what are called depthwise convolutional layers at far lower cost than a conventional convolution. So excluding the input, you'll see in this architecture, there are pairs of layers. I've already talked about, and I've talked about how the output of each set of convolutions you have in every layer is going to be the input to the next. So if you're trying to understand this diagram, you should see that this the filters that are described here. There are 32 filters, all shaped by 3 by 3. And then if you want to know the output, it's said here. And then you'll basically go through this table where there are pairings used. But the important thing to see here is tables such as this one, which compare depthwise versus full. You can see that for very similar amounts of accuracy, although we've had this strong assumption that all kernels in this case are going to share strongly from the spatial domain, you can still have very similar levels of accuracy. I'm going to skip this. I just want to be able to just lean into another application of convolutional neural networks, because actually we have a true expert in this domain. So in this area, the idea is that the design of the architectures I've talked so far are often used for discriminative tasks when you're doing classification and done on image. But there are a variety of other applications you can use these type of constructions for, one of which is this application of super resolution. And the idea here is that we're going to have a network that is going to be trained over a series of images, so that it starts to learn ways of not projecting downwards towards a single vector that indicates which class is actually being recognized, but actually projects outwards so that it can synthesize output where it's interpolated pieces of missing information. So you're actually able to have a CNN that can go from a low resolution piece of information to a high one, assuming that it's had enough examples to learn what are smart ways to interpolate between them. That's one way to think about this. And in this area, one of the key ideas is this notion of pixels shuffle, which was invented actually by one of the co-lecturers on this course for rank. So I want to ask him if he wants to maybe discuss for us some of the key ideas of pixel shuffle and how it works.
Yeah. So first of all, it was invented by not me, but a bunch of people whose names are shown below.
Sure. So I didn't need to, yes.
But it's just an important point, I think. Yeah. So here, as you can see, what we are doing in this network is on the left-hand side, you have the low-resolution image, which is then we apply a bunch of convolutions on it. None of these convolutions have a stride greater than 1, so the size of the image doesn't decrease as it would in a classifier. And then at the final layer, we use this subpixel convolution or pixel shuffle layer. And what this does is, so let's say that you started from 100 by 100 image, these feature maps stay 100 by 100 with some clever padding. And so these colorful squares at the end, this rainbow colored set of channels, is what the output of the network looks like after several layers of convolution. And each of these channels describes the pixels in a particular location within the block of pixels that would correspond to a low resolution pixel. So if you do super resolution, increasing the resolution 4 times, so then for each low resolution pixel, there's a block of 2 by 2 pixels that corresponds to that location in the image. And we are going to have one of these channels correspond to each of those locations within that block. So I think here we are showing a 3 by 3 super resolution. So we are super resolving both on the lengthwise and heightwise by 3 pixels. So we're going to end up with 9 channels, which are then rearranged to give the final pixel. And I think the significance of this was that previous approaches for doing super resolution with neural networks first did a rough interpolation of the image. So it turned the low resolution image into say a blurry interpolated high resolution image using like a baseline technique. And then the convolutions happened over the high resolution images, which improved how that image looked, improved the visual quality. But that meant that you had to do convolutions at the high resolution, which is obviously more expensive than what we are doing here, where all the convolutions happen on the low resolution feature maps. And so this idea of structuring the network this way allowed us to run this network for the first time in 2015 on the GPU of a mobile device that was a top-end iPhone at 24 frames per second. And that was like a big breakthrough because this was not possible before. And some of the savings on the computational costs that this layer and this way of organizing the network allowed us to do have resulted in our ability to actually implement this to run and do a real-time super resolution of a video on a mobile phone for the first time. All of these things are, by the way, trivial today. So not just high-end mobile phones will have computational photography and dedicated chips to do these neural network processing, but this was 5 years ago or more now. So then it was a little bit more of a breakthrough.
Thanks. So that was, I guess the emphasis we want to bring in here was that essentially it's the same primitives we're talking about but are being used for quite a radically different purpose. And so with the use of different loss functions that are going to set the parameters such that you're kind of really optimizing not for sort of classification error, but for some sort of perceptual related quality to the output, and it being improved. You can train these same primitives that I've been talking about for a variety of other types of applications. I just want to I know we're slightly over time, but I just want to talk for like 2 more minutes just to point out that there are, radically other types of applications that we haven't really touched upon for CNNs today. So, for example, there's a code example here, but you can even extend the use of CNNs to things such as graphs, because this means they have applications of a much wider variety of data types, because anything that you could represent as a set of information that has some structure associated to it, you can use a form of a CNN to digest this information and do things not only like recognition of different classes, but you can do things such as predict, in this case, for example, links between them, or you could start to recognize different types of classes. So an example that these types of CNNs are often used to recognize different forms of molecules and how they're going to combine. And although we're not going to go into it, again, by using these same sort of primitives, you represent you have representation that describes the connections between these and maybe some information associated with the nodes. You have very similar types of operations that can then be used for not just classification, but link prediction and a wide variety of things. So that is really what I wanted to cover today about CNNs, how they're designed, how the design is really informed from trying to include some specific types of inductive bias that were proven to work very well with images, but also have applications across a wider variety of cases. And then we've talked about sort of the simple case of how they function and the various types of extensions that are also sort of built upon the sort of core idea of a convolutional kernel operating across an input. So with that, I'm going to close the lecture, but then we'll carry on answering a few questions for those who can remain a bit longer. Let's see. Let me just do that. I'm just trying to, okay.